Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending this first LSE Election Observation Conference in this weather. You have really shown your commitment in trying to make elections great again. Okay, so it's my honor to share this keynote session. Dr. Klaas is going to talk about how politicians could rig an election. It's a relevant issue as we are deeply concerned about breaking down of democracies, even in consolidated democracies. Dr. Klaas is a fellow at the Department of Government here at the LSE. He was an election campaigner and is now a world-renowned scholar, policy advisor, and author on authoritarian politics and election manipulation, including 3 books: The Despot's Apprentice, The Despot's Accomplice, and How to Rig an Election. He investigates the problem that politicians in democracies may act like despots and make elections no longer fair and make political selection fail. In this keynote speech, we will learn a lot from Dr. Klaas, from his research and fieldwork experience around the world, especially about his opinion on election observation techniques. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. And again, I'll echo the comments of thank you for being here 10 a.m. on a snowy day. I have to admit, I'm from Minnesota in the US, where it was minus 27 degrees Celsius for Christmas. And so I find this hilarious how the London shuts down for half an inch of snow. But that being said, it is a challenge to travel in the capital. So I'm going to talk about a lot of this stuff that I'm going to tell you about today are insights that are coming out in a book that I've co-written with Professor Nick Chih-Hsin at the University of Birmingham, who was my advisor when I was a PhD student at Oxford. And it's called How to Rig an Election. And the title is obviously provocative, but it's not just showing how to do it, but also how we can stop despots and dictators and counterfeit Democrats from getting away with it. Because right now, the world is moving away from democracy. It has been for 11 years straight. And unfortunately, I think the outlook for the foreseeable future is still very bleak. Now, I think the way we start the book is we say that the greatest political paradox of our time is that there are more elections than ever before in human history, and still the world is becoming less democratic. And that is a perplexing puzzle because a lot of people think about democracy and elections as intertwined. And in fact, what is happening is a lot of authoritarian regimes are holding poor quality elections that allow them to legitimize their grip on power. And this is being done, in my opinion, and my co-author's opinion, with the either complicit involvement or at least the failings of Western governments and Western observers to hold regimes to account who are doing this. So in the talk today, I'm going to talk about the sort of broad brush of what's happening with election rigging. I'm going to give you lots of examples that are at times amusing but tragic because in spite of the fact that there are very innovative and interesting ways to rig elections, we have to keep in mind that these have serious consequences, terrible consequences for millions or billions of people around the planet. But also some solutions on how election observation can improve and how we can actually start to catch and condemn those who are the worst abusers of poor quality elections. Now I'm going to start with 3 stories of election rigging. These are mostly recent, the last decade or so, in 3 very different countries, one in Azerbaijan, one in Ukraine, and one in Madagascar. Madagascar being a country that I work a lot in. So in Azerbaijan's 2013 elections, they had a moment where they decided to try to show the international community how committed they were to democracy. And with that is that buzzword of transparency. So Azerbaijan is no democracy, it's a pure dictatorship. But that being said, they said, look, we're going to create an iPhone app, right? One of these shiny new iPhone apps you can download from the Apple Store. It'll have real-time results for the election. You can see as we count what the results are. Now, some people, including the observers and also excited citizens of Azerbaijan, downloaded the app before the election and were rather surprised if they logged onto it the day before the vote that the results had been populated and no one had voted yet. And still, the results showed that the dictator had been elected in a landslide. Now, inevitably, the journalists present asked, why did this happen? How have you released the results before anyone voted? And the government said, look, these are the old results. And they said, well, the numbers are different and the candidates are different to reflect all the new candidates. This doesn't seem like the old results. Sure enough, when the election actually happened, the results very closely matched what had been released. And in fact, they increased the tally for the dictator. So this is one aspect of election rigging, which is not exactly what you want to have if you are an autocrat, right? I mean, it's very easily determined that this election was rigged when you've released the results before the election. And on top of it, you had crude versions of election rigging like ballot box stuffing that were observed by monitors on the ground. So even though there were not a huge number of monitors throughout the country, in something like 40% of precincts where they visited, observers witnessed ballot box stuffing. They literally watched people put pre-marked ballots into boxes. Now, I'll come back to this in a moment for what the observers said about this election, but I'm going to go on to the second example. This is in Ukraine a couple years ago, and there was an area of an opposition stronghold where it was very clear that the opposition was going to basically run the table, right? They would probably get somewhere between 80 and 100% of the votes in this region. Now, when observers were watching them count the ballots, they were surprised to see that every single ballot in the ballot box was blank. And they thought, wow, we've seen people vote all day. It's an astonishing amount of coordination to convince 100% of people to cast protest votes rather than voting for their opposition candidate. What's going on here? Well, they then used the pens that were in the precinct and found out that after 10 minutes, the ink disappeared. And they had given to the opposition strongholds pens where once you vote, your ballot looks great to you. You think you voted, you put it in the ballot box, and it's empty. The ballot box is effectively empty. Now, what do you do if you're an observer in that situation? Well, you can't necessarily, as long as the rules and regulations are followed, you can't force a rerun of the election. The counting was done properly. There were 0 votes cast according to the rules of how a ballot is counted. And so this is a very clever type of election rigging. The third story I'm going to tell you is from Madagascar in 2006. And this is a very different type of election rigging, one that's becoming more prominent. The main challenger to the incumbent president had been forced into exile when the incumbent president took power. And so he was living abroad, mostly in Paris, and tried to register to be a candidate. Now, the rules in Madagascar's election law say that you have to register to be a candidate in person. So this involves the person in exile coming back home and then signing the paper in person declaring their candidacy. Now, in a particularly amusing but tragic way, the candidate in exile tried to come back on 4 different occasions, and every time as the plane started its descent, lo and behold, the president decreed that all the airports in the country were closed. And they were closed until the plane had to turn around, which was quite inconvenient for the commercial passengers coming from Paris on a 12-hour flight. So the exiled candidate was polite and decided to start making his attempts from nearby Mauritius instead, but still the plane was turned around. Lo and behold, the deadline of 6 months before the election passed. The candidate had not been in person, and therefore he was disqualified from running. Now, from the point of view of an election observer, the law was followed. The law says you have to be there in person. He was not. He was therefore disqualified legitimately, according to the law, right? Now, the reason why all these stories are the way I start off my remarks today is because all 3 of these elections were praised. All 3 of these elections were endorsed, and all 3 of them had at least some people saying they were free and fair, right? Which is the moniker that is given to good elections, right? There's basically 2 binary choices in a lot of press reports about elections: free and fair, not free and fair. All 3 of these got to some extent praise of free and fair. In the Azerbaijan contest, diplomatic representatives, congressmen, European Parliament members, etc., praised the election, despite the fact that there was credible witnessing of mass ballot box stuffing and the iPhone app debacle. They praised it as incredibly efficient and free and a great election. And there's myriad examples of quotes of praise for this regime's totally sham election. And in the Madagascar case, it was officially endorsed universally. There were no Western observers who condemned that election. Now, this is a snapshot of the failing of election observation, right? Because these are clear examples of rigged elections. They're clear examples where the autocrat involved or the despot involved manipulated the rules in a way that would make it so that they would retain power illegitimately while still, and this is the holy grail for a despot, getting praise from the international community, right? And this is where the sort of strategic impetus and the strategic rationale of election rigging comes into focus. So there's two main puzzles that I'm going to talk about today. One is how do despots, dictators, and counterfeit democrats, the counterfeit democrats is a term that I use, that I've coined, which is effectively what it means, right? I mean, they're trying to pass themselves off as committed to democracy, and they are not. They're counterfeits. And this is a catch-all category for a lot of sort of semi-democratic regimes. How do they get away with this? And how do they rig elections to ensure that they do, right? So these aspects of election rigging that I've talked about are newer forms of manipulation that exhibit learning on the parts of autocrats, where they have improved their tactics in ways that make it more difficult to condemn elections in certain ways, right? Now, this has given rise to a body of research that is where our book is very firmly situated, which is called strategic rigging. So if you think about the history of elections, and we have a graph in the book that shows basically the number of elections held per year globally, it spikes and absolutely surges after 1991, and to a lesser extent 1989. And it's the fall of the Soviet Union precipitates a mass change of democratization, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where previously one-party states start to hold nominally competitive elections, where at least there's multi-party candidates, and you have some competition, you have some people actually lose elections, right? Which is an important shift in democratization. Now, that explosion of democracy brought in a huge number of people into the sphere of elections who didn't think that strategically. So they just started doing the crude types of election rigging that you sort of think about, which are ballot box stuffing, violence, intimidation, forcibly closing polling stations. And what all of those crude election strategies have in common is that they're visible. They're extremely visible. If you watch somebody stuff ballots, you can see it, right? If you watch some soldiers go into a precinct and shut it down or threaten voters with guns, you can observe it, right? And that has costs associated with it. And this is one of the most important things to understand about election rigging, is that it is a dance between those who benefit from rigging elections to stay in power and those in the West who try to hold them accountable. And I do say the West because it is almost exclusively Western governments and Western observation missions. Not completely, but for the most part, they are the largest player in holding regimes accountable for nefarious manipulation of elections, right? And it's this cat and mouse game. How much can we get away with and still get praised? How much can we get away with in terms of rigging and still maintain international legitimacy? So the question for observers and for Western governments is how to raise the costs of rigging. And right now, for a lot of autocrats, the costs are very low. And that is why you have persistence of poor quality elections. Now, the cost has been raised over the last couple decades for crude election rigging. So if you can imagine an election that's got ballot box stuffing, highly visible in 2018, it's not hard to imagine that you have, and I'll talk about this a little later in my remarks, many mechanisms to detect and condemn that, right? I mean, you don't need observers. If people are stuffing ballots into ballot boxes, a voter can take a photo with their iPhone and send it to the observation team, right? It's much easier, so it's much more visible. And as a result of that, plus innovations in how election observation has occurred and how election observers have improved their work, crude rigging is more costly than it used to be. So what is the response then? Well, the response is strategic rigging. So if you can't get away with the highly visible and highly obvious forms of election rigging, you have to come up with ways to rig elections either out in the open that are in accordance with the law, as I'll talk about a bit more, but that would be the Madagascar example would be a prime candidate for that. Or you have to find ways to do invisible rigging, right? Where you rig the election in ways that are hard to detect or difficult to condemn for anyone who's watching. And that is the realm of the sort of crude, the crude autocrat becoming the clever autocrat. And it's this learning that has happened where observers are unfortunately still very often a step behind, but they're a step behind not because they haven't learned themselves, but because they're getting outsmarted. And I think that is one of the key challenges of the 21st century, is how to deal with savvier despots and dictators who are rigging elections with this in mind in a way to get away with it. So I also think, just to briefly talk about that international dimension, I'll conclude with this, so I'm just going to briefly introduce the idea. But if you don't have the West paying attention, if the West doesn't care about rigged elections, then it is crystal clear what these regimes will do. They will push the limit of what they can get away with even further, right? And this is an important foreshadowing moment for, I think, what we're seeing in 2018. I'll come back to this. So I'm going to talk for a little while about the different types of election rigging. And we highlight several different types in the book, but I'm going to go through just a few of the main ones. So I've already discussed ballot box stuffing a bit. Now, ballot box stuffing does not just have downsides in how visible it is. It also has logistical downsides. And this is the thing when I've interviewed a large number of heads of state and their henchmen and ministers, et cetera, about election tactics. And one of the things they'll say to you off the record is, look, we have 20,000 precincts on the island. This is in Madagascar. We need 20,000 guys to go to an area the size of France, to all these different precincts, and stuff ballots. That's really hard. It's not guaranteed. It's expensive. We have to bribe everyone to do this, and it's highly visible, right? So you can see a huge number of downsides here. But if you have 20,000 precincts and you need 20,000 henchmen, why not just disqualify the main candidate, right? So you can see how it's not just about visibility, it's also about the logistical challenges associated with different types of election rigging, how attractive they are to an autocrat. And this is where, from Nick and I doing interviews with people who have rigged elections, it's a very straightforward cost-benefit analysis. And so this is something where they're thinking very carefully about how can we do it, how can we actually make sure we're going to win, and the second part of it, how can we get away with it? Ballot box stuffing is becoming less in vogue because of all the downsides and a lot of limited upside, right? Even if you do have the 20,000 guys, how are you sure that they deliver? How can you enforce that they actually perform the way you think they will? And how can you ensure that they give the right margin without overstuffing? In other words, are they going to know, if they're not a very educated person, that this precinct has 350 registered voters, and if you stuff 375 ballots, it's obvious the election was rigged, right? So there's a lot of risks associated with this. The second one that is also highly visible, but can be extremely effective, is violence and repression. And this is, it ranges from anything from intimidation or violence against, strategic violence against opposition strongholds, right, where you have troops go through, maybe burn down villages as a way to sort of send a message to people who might vote against the regime, all the way up to assassinating opponents. Right, so assassinations of political candidates happen in Mexico. Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan was assassinated, and there is still an ongoing investigation, but a lot of people suspect that it was regime associated. And there's, depending on what type of violence, it's more or less effective. Obviously, the international press, international observers pay attention to this, right? So on the visibility aspect of it, violence is not a very subtle strategy. In Kenya's 2007 elections, it was obvious that there was violent repression happening. That being said, the upside of violence and repression is that it makes a lasting impact. And so this is where you introduce the idea of election rigging that is not necessarily in each election, but has lingering effects into the next one. Now, what I mean by this, I think this is a beautiful phrase that my co-author came up with, where he said, all you need to do with violence and repression is to shake the matchbox. What he means by that is he says, think about like an arsonist, right? An arsonist burns down a home. And then you go over to your neighbor's house and you shake a matchbox at their house. You don't need to burn down their house. You just need to remind them that you could, right? And this is what's happening with a lot of violent and repressive elections and their regimes around the world is people are scared. They're still scared a decade later. They don't need the government to show them every single time what they're capable of. They need to remind them that it happened. And so this is where, an election observation team cannot necessarily condemn an election for fear-mongering rhetoric, right? So it's very common that you may remind about the events, those unfortunate events of a decade ago. We certainly wouldn't want to go back to them, right? Sending a very not-so-subtle signal to voters in opposition areas that, look, maybe you should stay home this time because the consequences could be severe, right? So this is another angle where there's a highly visible type of election rigging, but maybe strategic for the future, even if it's not strategic for the short term. The third type is invisible rigging. Now, this has multiple different types, right? So what I say about invisible rigging is it's the type where it's either done in ways that are legal or it's done in ways that are genuinely difficult to detect. So I've given the example of the Madagascar exclusion of the opposition candidate, which is a growing tactic, right? Is finding a legal way to exclude a candidate. It even goes to the realm of changing constitutions based on age or ethnicity or a variety of other factors that are specific. I had breakfast yesterday with a aspiring politician from Sri Lanka, whose dad used to be the president, and the constitution was changed with him in mind, where they changed the eligibility age of the president because they were worried that he would become the heir apparent, right? So this type of constitutional or legal change that occurs is one in which you can do it out in the open, right? I mean, as long as you're following the law, there are very limited tools that Western governments and observers have to condemn legal changes that are aimed at illegitimately manipulating elections. Because the framework that they're supposed to use is, was the election illegal? And I'll come back to that idea in a moment. Now, another story that I think very effectively captures this type of invisible rigging or the difficult to condemn rigging happened in St. Petersburg's mayoral elections in 1997. It's one of my favorite stories it's like one of these things when you study election rigging, you've got to give some of these guys credit. They are amusingly clever at times. So the main opposition candidate was named Oleg Sergeyev. And the regime was operating in a world where they were saying, look, this is nonpartisan elections, it's local elections, even though it was clear that the incumbent was affiliated with the president, et cetera, and the regime, right? Now, because there was no party affiliation listed on the ballot, that meant that all that the regime needed to do was find a guy named Oleg Sergeyev, who was a pensioner, and find another guy named Oleg Sergeyev who drove a bus, and convince them, with bribes, presumably, to register to be candidates. So then when voters went into the precinct, there were 3 Oleg Sergeyevs on the ballot, and no identification of who was the tram driver, who was the pensioner, and who was the politician. So the voters split the vote 3 ways, and inevitably the incumbent won. Now, there was nothing illegal about that. It was done in accordance with electoral law, and the electoral law was written with consultation of Western groups that said, look, actually it's a good thing that you have nonpartisan elections, so it's nice that we have no party affiliation on the ballot. So in some ways, there was actually involvement of Western groups in setting up a system that could be exploited in this way. Now, again, somewhat invisible. That being said, every voter knew what happened, right? I mean, if you go in and you see Theresa May's ballot, they're named 3 times. I know that you don't vote for prime ministers on the same way, but it's if you had that sort of situation where you had the Conservative Party candidate listed 3 times on a ballot, just by name, you would know that the election was being manipulated. So it was an open secret, but it was also very difficult to condemn because it was, by all intents and purposes, legal. The fourth type of election rigging that's a very important one, and still very common even though it is somewhat visible, is vote buying. And this is where you simply give cash to people to vote a certain way. Now, this has been widespread for a long time. Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, it's very common. And vote buying, sometimes in Sub-Saharan Africa you see where you can buy a huge amount of votes by simply buying off one local leader, right? So you sort of bribe the local leader, and the local leader tells all the people in the community, vote for this party. And then they do, and you end up getting 100% votes. And they're actually cast, right? They're not actually ballot box stuffed or anything like that. They're people actually going to the polls, but they're going to the polls for a financial incentive. Now, this one also it shows learning, but it's learning on the part of voters. And this is why vote buying has become less attractive, is that voters have realized in a lot of countries that they can take the money and vote for whoever they want, right? So if you have a genuinely secret ballot, and you've just taken $10 to vote for a candidate, or $5, or a bribe in the form of a t-shirt, depending on the country, it's difficult to enforce that you actually go into the secret ballot, cast the ballot, and do it in the right way, right? So the sort of enforcement mechanism is sometimes lacking. Now, this being a dance between learning on the voting side and learning on the rigging side, authoritarian regimes have come up with innovative ways to deal with this. So there's a few of them. One is that in some countries, ballot box papers are not the sort of single ballot paper that we are used to in the West, where you have one sheet of paper and a list of all the candidates. There are many countries where the party puts the ballot paper for its slate of candidates in an envelope with all of the other parties. And the way you vote is you take out all of the other parties and leave the one that you want to stay in the envelope. Now, if you think about how that would be advantageous to enforcement, you say, look, I'll give you $10 when you come out with all of the other parties' ballots, right? To prove that you have left our ballot in the envelope. So obviously there's an angle of election rigging that's related to how electoral procedures unfold, right? And how the rules are set up. There was even a case in Senegal where a prominent musician said that the entrance fee to a free concert was all of the other parties' ballots. Right? So if you brought all the other parties' ballots, you could go to this free concert. Now that's a form of vote buying because you get this benefit, but it's one that technically the regime was not officially affiliated with or sanctioning, and yet it obviously behind the scenes had some sort of agreement, right? There's other aspects that have been very clever but abused, where you have procedures in some countries where you can voice vote if you are, say, disabled in a certain way, right? So you have voters going in and pretending to be, blind, for example, and they don't have Braille ballots. So they say, okay, well, under this procedure, blind candidates can vote. And then the henchman from the regime is waiting outside the precinct window, waiting for you to say, I vote for this person, and then the money changes hands, right? So you can see how there's all these sort of loopholes that get exploited for vote buying to try to become more, better enforced in ways from the regime. But there's also a large amount of movement where voters are taking the money and voting their conscience. And this is, again, one of the reasons why vote buying is becoming somewhat less attractive, not unattractive, but somewhat less attractive in certain countries. Now, you do have bags of cash still changing hands in certain sub-Saharan African countries. In Thailand, for example, the vote buying is so systematic that there's a term called the Night of the Howling Dogs, which is the night before the election when everybody anticipates it's like your Christmas bonus or whatever. You're about to get some money. So it's built into your financing. All these things are part of the electoral process in countries that have a history of it. Vote buying, by the way, I'll just very quickly mention, it's one of these interesting angles of it where there's also the question you have to ask as an observer and as a supporter of democracy, which is, if vote buying is why people vote, what happens when vote buying stops, right? And what happens if we end up with an election where vote buying gets purged from the system and then the turnout is 20%, right? And then all of a sudden the election itself is illegitimate. Now, of course, no one condones vote buying, but there may need to be a transition period where the international community's message is not don't accept bribes, because that message does not work, but is accept the bribe and vote for who you want, right? It's sort of trying to convince people that if they're going to take the money, they should still vote their conscience. And if it was widespread enough, it would decrease the effectiveness of that tactic and hopefully decrease the how common it was. Another tactic that's much more common in Western countries, and for this one I'm going to briefly talk about the United States where I'm from, is gerrymandering and voter suppression.
What was it called?
Gerrymandering and voter suppression. So gerrymandering is a term that refers to drawing districts in ways that distort the will of the voter. So it's basically where the politicians choose who their voters are as opposed to voters choosing who their politicians are. So in other words, you have a block of people, you know what the demographics of a group of an area are, and you draw a district accordingly to ensure that you maximize your representation based on the vote share. So the term comes from one of those sort of nice trivia bits. Elbridge, his name was Gary, although it's now Jerry. Elbridge Gerry was a governor of Massachusetts in the late 1700s, and he presided over a district reallocation that a local newspaper cartoonist thought looked like a salamander. So gerrymander was born as a portmanteau of those two words. Now, sadly, the Elbridge Gerry was actually really instrumental in building checks and balances and constitution writing and did a lot of positive things. And he personally condemned the districting, but the name stuck. So he's known through history for this thing that he didn't like, and everything else he did was completely wiped away. But anyway, gerrymandering it's a big problem in the US because I'll open this up for, I play this guessing game with my students on Thursday. Anyone want to take a guess at what the average margin of victory was in the 2016 House of Representatives election? So there's 435 House races. It's sort of like the House of Commons, right? What the average margin of victory was. So if it's 55-45, it's 10 points. In the US, 435 wide average. Anyone want to take a guess?
20.
Okay, any others?
5.
5? So 20 is much closer, but it's still almost half as bad as it is. So it's 37.1%. Now, that means that you're about 70-30 is the average House race, right? Now, it's a big problem. That's a huge problem. Now, it's partly due to what's called demographic clustering, which is where people in rural Texas are all Republicans and people in San Francisco are all Democrats. So it's hard to draw a competitive district there anyway. But it's also distorted by politicians drawing districts trying to maximize safe seats and then make sure that their opponents have split the vote effectively, right? So you're splitting out the Democrats into, if you're doing it as a Republican, you split out the Democrats so that you're in a series of, maybe one seat where you get 95% of the vote and the rest of them it's distorted because it's lowered, right? So you give them the one token seat and then as a result, all the other elections that wouldn't be competitive are suddenly competitive for the Republicans. The impact of this is substantial on multiple fronts, right? I mean, in addition to the fact that it distorts the will of the voters, and you have some states in the US where the popular vote in Congress is roughly 50-50, Republicans win 75% of the vote, of the seats rather. So that's hugely distortionary. But it's also, and this is for a different talk, but it also, if you're trying to understand why Republicans are supporting Trump, this is the answer. Because there were only 8 incumbents out of 435 that lost elections in 2016 in the House because of uncompetitive elections. And that means that the average Republican is in a race where they're going to win 70-30, right? If they're in a race where they're going to win 70-30, the only way they lose their seat is if a primary challenger from the Republican Party says that you're not backing Trump enough, not that you're not sane enough, right? And a very small number of people who participate in primary elections can be the thing that defeats incumbents, whereas the general election is absolutely of no worry to most of these people. So it explains completely why there is a dynamic of fealty to Trump, even though many of the people in the party do not like him, right? It's electoral math. Voter suppression is another element of this, where you have changes to electoral law to try to ensure that certain types of voters do not vote, right? In the US, this is most pronounced in certain red states where they create, red being Republican states, where they create overly burdensome regulations that disproportionately disenfranchise poor and minority voters who tend to vote for Democrats. It can be done with things like identification cards being required that in the US are only really issued to people who have driver's licenses, right? So my ID card in the US, I have a passport, but most people, about half of Americans don't have passports. So you have driver's licenses being the main form of identification. It costs $20. You have to go and wait for a couple hours at the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles. And if you're somebody who's really poor and working multiple jobs and doesn't have the time to hire or the money to pay for childcare to go do this, or simply isn't going to spend $20 on a driver's license, it's effectively a poll tax, right? Where it costs $20 to be able to vote. That has a real effect. And in places like Wisconsin, which was one of the 3 states that was instrumental to Trump's win, there was a voting law passed shortly before the 2016 election that arguably depressed turnout in the black community around places like Milwaukee in ways that would have been sufficient to change the vote to Hillary. So again, it's very difficult to say the counterfactual because, and that's by design, right? I mean, this is one of the reasons why this voting rigging tactic is so effective is it's very, very difficult to say how many people didn't vote as a result of regulations, but it would likely be substantial. So this is to say that there is vote rigging in the West, election rigging in the West. It is just done in very sophisticated and very open ways, right? I mean, gerrymandering is done openly, but it is done through a legal process and is therefore not frequently condemned. There is movement on this, before I move on to the next tactic. The Supreme Court has started to hear cases related to gerrymandering, and some states have struck down gerrymandered maps in ways that could prove highly consequential in the elections that are happening in November. And the next one, digital manipulation and hacking the vote. So this is the new frontier. Russia is certainly going to be highly involved in this realm of election manipulation. But just to suffice it to say, I can talk about this more in the Q&A because I'm cognizant of time, but there's going to be a significant rise in misinformation and disinformation campaigns that take advantage of the weakness of democracy, which is citizen information, and the way that we process news. In addition to that, there's a more direct form of election rigging that can happen digitally, which is effectively hacking into voting machines or hacking into registration databases. And the nightmare scenario, this is particularly true for the United States, but the nightmare scenario that I think about for 2018 or 2020 is there are 15 states that use what are called direct recording voting machines, where you push a touchscreen button and the only record of your vote is in the computer chip. If that machine is hacked, you could simply change the software so it says every time you vote for a Democrat, switch it to a Republican. Right? That would be totally possible, not difficult to do. And in fact, researchers from the University of Michigan, trying to get the attention of the government on this, hacked into a voting machine and made it so that every time somebody cast a vote, it played the University of Michigan's fight song. And that did get the government's attention, but for a variety of reasons, the Trump administration has done virtually nothing to shore up the digital integrity of American elections. And last week, there was more information that Russia successfully penetrated the voter registration databases in 7 states. It's still unclear whether anything was changed. There's no evidence to suggest it was. But it shows that they could purge a huge number of people from the voter roll. And the US has no constitutionally mandated pathway on how to redo an election. So you imagine the nightmare scenario where you find out that the voter machine was hacked, or you find out that everybody with an African American or Hispanic sounding last name was purged from a voter roll. What do you do, right? For 4 years you have that government because the US doesn't have a legal pathway to rerun an election. And especially for those reasons. So this is something that would be extremely damaging to the legitimacy of democracy. It will be something that Western Europe grapples with increasingly, and it's why I've written multiple times about the importance of having a paper trail in all elections. Every single election should be readily auditable with a paper trail that a voter can see that their vote was recorded in a certain way. The final point I wanted to make before I get into some solutions is geopolitics. So I talked about how the West is sort of in this cat and mouse game with election rigging. This is where I think, the Azerbaijan election was not praised because people thought it was good. This is the one with the iPhone app. It was praised because Azerbaijan has strategic importance to Western governments. It was praised because of natural gas, right? And so one of the really difficult hurdles to overcome for election observers, and I'll talk about this in solutions in a second, is the coordination between government policy that has foreign policy and strategic implications and observers. Because many observation groups are tied to governments, and they cannot condemn an election that the government has a vested interest in maintaining good relations with. And so you have this where terrible elections are praised for geopolitical expediency. On top of that, you have a major shift that's happened in the last year in which the US, basically, I think that international politics, this is the way I see the world. I see the world as having 4 main players that can affect global politics virtually anywhere on the planet. And those are the US, the EU, and the UK together, and then Russia and China. And the problem is the latter 2 they don't care about democracy. The former 2 do, but Trump has willingly given up US intervention in favor of democracy and is actually very, very he's got a crystal clear view of strongman as positive, which the US has not been perfect on this front, but this is much worse. And the EU and the UK are so preoccupied with Brexit that things like elections in Malawi are not rating, right? They're not nearly as important, and a lot of people in foreign policy are diverted from things like election observation into Brexit negotiations. That means that there is a major shift where governments are able to get away with a significantly larger margin of election rigging than they were in the past, because people are not paying attention. And, this is the second point, Trump is actively endorsing rigged elections. So I know that Turkey will come up today. The Turkish referendum in 2017 was clearly rigged. It was a referendum to dismantle serious parts of democracy in Turkey and consolidate power for Erdogan. The night of the election, as information was coming out that it was rigged, Trump called Erdogan and congratulated him, right? Now, and this feeds into my first point about how to solve this problem, is you need better coordination between what's called low-level democracy promotion and high-level democracy promotion. The State Department did sort of the right thing with the Turkish referendum. They highlighted the irregularities and they said that they need to be accounted for. But if you're Erdogan, do you really care about a State Department report when the President of the United States has called you and said, great job? No. So it undercuts every aspect of election observation and every election monitor's report if the high-level messages are in praise of a bad election. And that's what happens very often. Azerbaijan was an example of that, where some of the observer groups did condemn the election, but the politicians endorsed it. So the first solution is better coordination between high-level and low-level democracy promotion, including election observers. The second is that I think election observers need to have more of a backbone. And what I mean by that is they need to have certain triggers that automatically force them to condemn elections. With the Madagascar election, in which the main opposition rival was excluded from the vote, why did they stay? Why did they continue to check how the election observation occurred on election day? It didn't matter. If you have Trump versus Clinton and Clinton is excluded, is that election ever going to be legitimate? No. If there's no Democrat on the ballot, nobody would consider saying this was an acceptable election. Yet routinely in developing countries, excluded candidates are taken out of the equation, taken off the ballot, and then the observers say, well, there were no irregularities on election day. You didn't need irregularities on election day. The vote was already stolen. So election observers need to have more triggers that automatically force them to condemn elections and leave the country, because that will actually impose geopolitical costs. It will say, there will be a story that says, look, the Carter Center and the EU left Madagascar because they had determined this was already a sham vote. That's a major story, right? As opposed to the half-day story that is these sort of rote reports that say, oh, we observed some irregularities, blah, blah, blah. Third is that we need to have a new language around election observation, which observers, to their credit, have adopted, but also in how we talk about it in mainstream politics, that is not just binary, not just free and fair and not free and fair. Because the problem is that not free and fair usually comes with a loss of foreign aid or a downgrading of a diplomatic relationship. That means that there is not a very clear mechanism for how a country can condemn an election for being bad, but praise it for being better than the last one without cutting off foreign aid. In other words, there's not really a 1 to 10 metric that says this election was a 7, which is not great, but it was a 5 last time, so we're going to continue giving them foreign aid, right? That should be part of the conversation where we can reward progress even as we're condemning the parts that are bad. Right now, what's happening instead is what I call electoral grade inflation, where because you don't want to pull the trigger on cutting off aid or cutting off military relationships, et cetera, you end up saying the election was good when you know it was bad. And so there needs to be a lexicon that says this election was seriously flawed, but it's moving in the right direction, therefore we will continue to reward the country with aid and military and strategic partnerships. Fourth is I think we need even more long-term election observation. So there's a difference between long-term and short-term. Short-term is where you're, like when I was observing Madagascar's 2013 elections, you had long-term observers, like sort of 3 teams of 2 people who were in various places throughout the countryside. And then the week before the election, 45 people fly in and then they leave 3 days after the election. And they don't know anything about the context necessarily, or they have a limited amount of understanding compared to the long-term observers. This has been an improvement that election monitoring teams have actually adopted, and it didn't used to exist at all. But it needs to be much more of a focus, because now the rigging is happening strategically. It is almost always invisible by election day in the smart autocracies. And this is where one of the US diplomats, a US ambassador to a country, told me that only amateurs rig elections on election day anymore, and I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And then the final thing that I would suggest needs to happen is using technology to crowdsource election monitoring. So I have the idea that I'd like to develop into a research grant and project that is effectively creating an election monitoring app that anybody can download, and that they can do things like be at the precinct when the tally is announced and make sure that it matches the officially reported tally. Because if you've got 20,000 precincts, most of them are not being observed. And a lot of the election rigging can happen at the sort of aggregation level, where you say, look, they counted the ballots fine while the observers were there, but then they didn't have a record because there was no observer in the actual room that said, okay, there were 300 votes for this candidate and 200 for that candidate. And instead, it goes to 400, 100 when they aggregate it, right? If you had people who were taking photos at the precinct, or taking photos if they saw a soldier in the precinct, or taking photos if they saw ballot box stuffing, you could actually create things like heat maps that show where the rigging is happening. And it would be much more information, as opposed to what happens now, which is sort of a whack-a-mole process where observers go to precinct A, the people affiliated with the regime say, look, down the road is precinct B. They call precinct B, they say the observers are coming, don't rig. then they go to precinct B, then they leave, then they rig, right? And there's actually a lot of research that shows that election rigging gets displaced as a result of observers as opposed to being eliminated. So wherever the observers go, there's no rigging, but everywhere else they compensate by rigging more. Anyway, I think these are 5 solutions that are starting points. Inevitably, the autocrats will learn, but we have to be much better at learning faster. And that's what I would close with, and I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you. So, yeah, please.
I think I might be saying every example you gave from the US looked at things from a democratic perspective, so it was anti-republican.
Love it.
Yeah. I think I might be saying with all the US examples you gave, they were from the democratic perspective, so
sure.
Anti-republican, anti-Trump. Would you like to have a go at the other?
Sure.
Things at the other way, please.
Yeah. So the reason I did that is because with gerrymandering, and you're right to ask this question. With gerrymandering, it is more prominent among Republicans than Democrats, but Democrats also do it. So every independent analysis that I've seen has shown that there is a disproportionate amount of gerrymandering, and that most of the states that are the most egregious examples are held by Republicans, but Democrats certainly do it in some blue states. That doesn't, and of course throughout history Democrats have done it. I'm just talking about the current snapshot. One of the analyses that's been done recently suggests that Republicans have gained about 20 seats net due to gerrymandering, which doesn't mean that there's just 20 gerrymandered seats, but it means that there's 20 more Republican gerrymandered seats than there are Democratic ones. And that's roughly the same as the House of Representatives margin. So that's why I focus on that. Voter suppression is largely a Republican tactic. I mean, it's one of these things where I know that it sounds biased, but it is. Republicans Republican states have much stricter vote laws. Now, they would say it's to prevent illegal voters from voting, right? The empirical evidence on this shows that the largest study that was done showed that there were 31 credible cases of voter fraud in the United States over the last billion ballots cast over 14 years, because the penalties are extremely severe. If you double cast a ballot or you vote illegally, it's a felony. You can go to jail for 5+ years. So the idea that illegal immigrants would do this when their number one goal is to avoid detection from the state is, I think, bizarre fantasy. I mean, it's why, when you hear Trump talk about California being this hotbed of illegal Hispanic voting, it's like, so in the state where everybody knew Hillary was going to win by 30 points, illegal immigrants risked their being deported to go cast a ballot for her? I mean, it makes no sense, right? I mean, everyone knew it was going to be a 30-point margin. You wouldn't risk going to jail or being deported for that. So there is limited empirical evidence or no empirical evidence of Democrats attempting to suppress votes. And in fact, states like mine, Minnesota, which is controlled by Democrats, has some of the most open voting laws in the country, with basically no fraud, and it has the highest voter turnout in the US. It's usually 70+%. So, whereas other states that are extremely restrictive will have below 40% turnout. The nationwide turnout in 2014, partly as a result of voter suppression, was 36.4%, which a lot of election observers in Africa would condemn an election with that turnout rate for being illegitimate. That being said, of course, throughout history, the story of the Democrats was flipped in, say, the 60s, and they were mostly a Southern party that definitely engaged in voter suppression to a huge degree. So just in the snapshot of time, it's more concentrated. I would say on the Democratic side of the foreign policy aspect, my first book takes the Obama administration to task hugely for its complicity in supporting authoritarian regimes, right? And the way that everybody knows the US has good relationships with Saudi Arabia dating back a very long time. But beyond that, there's also just sort of complicity in endorsing poor quality elections that his State Department also was involved in. And the way I put it is I say, look, the Obama era and the George W. Bush era and the Clinton era had two-faced US foreign policy when it came to democracy. In other words, they would praise and actually support democracy when it was in their interest, and they would turn a blind eye to authoritarian regimes when it was also in their interest, right? And it was very duplicitous, but it was better than nothing. And it's better than what's happening right now, which is a uniform praise for authoritarian regimes. So you didn't used to have things like the President of the United States praising Vladimir Putin or Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines and inviting him to the White House, or in places where I've worked like Thailand, rolling out the red carpet for a state visit after a coup. Things like this are significantly worse than they used to be, which is why I'm focusing on it. I don't actually see it as a Republican-Democrat issue, because I don't think that most mainstream Republicans are on board with this foreign policy that Trump has. I see it as authoritarian populism versus genuine democracy that I used to believe was a bipartisan tenet of American foreign policy, if that makes sense.
Oh, we don't.
Shall I project? Or?
Yeah, sure. I can hear you.
Yeah, this is the one. I'm Snally. I actually work at the Commonwealth, which is currently reviewing its election observation guidelines. There were kind of two things I wanted to ask about. One is the role of election management bodies, particularly independent election management
Yep.
bodies. I know I've observed in Ukraine, and that's slightly different because it's government associated. But I think one of the challenges that has come up with the Commonwealth is that a lot of the election management bodies want to deliver and they take the election reports very seriously, but then lack support.
Yep.
And that's partly a political issue, but it's also an external
Yep.
support. So, sort of, how can election observation be more helpful for them in continuing the process, so it's not just about, okay, you've done X, Y, and Z wrong, and what do we do next?
Sure.
The other thing is the use of technology. And basically, do you think there's a role for technology? Because a lot of European countries have basically ruled it out because they don't feel that it can be made trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of African countries are using it, and India is a fantastic example. Until recently, it was considered quite a trustworthy system, and now it's political reasons that are questioning that technology. So, yeah, is there a way that it can be used and it can be useful, but not undermine trust, or not be used as a tool to say, oh, it's been hacked? Because I think that was a challenge in America, is that even when there wasn't hacking, there was a possibility of it.
Sure.
And that's
Those are great questions. So with the election management bodies, I think there's a few things. One is that you're right to point out this question of independence, because a lot of election management bodies are not independent and they're just rubber stamps for the regime. They do its bidding, etc. I think for independent election management bodies, the challenge is to ensure that their decision-making and also their reporting actually has political consequences. And that's where, again, this coordination between the election observers and the governments that they usually work very closely with is so important. I also think that observers can do more to ensure that election management bodies don't have extremely obvious problems that are visible a million miles away, that they solve them earlier. In other words, there are times where election management bodies have problems with how they manage the actual election that the observers have been saying, like, look, this is going to be an issue. You're going to have a problem with this. They don't listen. And I think it's where you have to have these sort of more extreme responses where you say, look, if you don't change this, we will not be able to endorse this election. And I think there does need to be more of that, where there's international best practices that are not just Western imperialism. They're actually developed in consultation with a lot of different governments around the world. And if you can say, as a block of election observation groups, we will leave the country and not observe this election if there is some aspect that is egregious. And if you don't make this reform in time, we will certainly do so. So I think that is one angle that there could be more support. The second part of it, the political part, is the harder one, because you have to change foreign policy, right? And unfortunately, what tends to happen is, anyone who's done an election observation has seen this, I'm sure, at least once, where the report actually is reasonably scathing, right? It says like a lot of very detailed things. But the executive summary comes out, maybe the day after the election when the media attention's gone. Usually some sort of bigwig flies in from a European capital or America to sort of do the press release or the press report. They tend to say like the nice things because they don't want to create a diplomatic incident. And then the full report comes out 6 months later and no one reads it, right? And if you're an autocrat, you don't care about that report. I mean, the report can be used potentially if you have extremely well-organized civil society and opposition parties to point out that there are actual irregularities that happened. But unless that happens, they just get away with it because it just gets buried on a website somewhere. The second question, remind me, you said
technology.
Yeah, technology. So I think, a decade ago, I think if I was giving this speech a decade ago, or if I was in a conference a decade ago, everyone would say, like, technology will save us. I don't think anyone thinks that anymore. And I think that most people say that, like, it's the cat and mouse logic just put into a different digital realm. So, Twitter was supposed to topple governments. Now it's like, well, the governments are co-opting it too, right? And they it's just another tool. We call it, the chapter is called in the book, The Digital Battleground, in my first book, because it's just just a new area. It's not like it all of a sudden has completely changed the balance of power. Yeah, it certainly changes calculations. So iPhone photos or camera phone photos have made vote buying and ballot box stuffing less easy to get away with, certainly, right? So that changes calculations, but then it just crops up in a different area. That's harder to detect.
Let's say with phone photos, people take photos of the ballot paper and use it to prove that they voted.
Yeah. Well, and not just that, but then also governments are using, they can either shut down the internet, right? So in Uganda's elections last year, they just shut down or 2016, they shut down the election, during the election, they shut down the internet so that mobile networks were gone. And you also can use technology to spread false information, certainly, which authoritarian regimes have figured out how to do, and they're going to get better at it. So I think that, and in terms of actual digital technology with elections, like the voting process, I think there's the upside is speed. The downside is legitimacy. If we can wait 4 hours to figure out the result because people have to count the ballots. I just think at the end of the day, you need to have a paper trail, and I don't think there's a real upside to digital technology for actual vote processing. There can be for things like voter registration. It may be the case that you end up doing more with fingerprint technology and things like that. But that being said, if an election happens in a place where the election management body has pressure put on it by the government, they can simply use that technology to disqualify people. Right? They'll just say, the machine's not working in the opposition area. I'm sorry. So to me, I think that the old systems are sufficient. It's just a question of political will more than some sort of panacea that comes in a digital format.
Hi, my name's Rebecca Cox, and I've participated in quite a few observation missions, particularly with the EU. It's a really interesting talk, and I absolutely agree with you on the cat and mouse phenomenon. But I would just, it's really more of a comment than a question.
Sure.
I would just comment that as with rigging, ranging from crude to the sophisticated, I think that it's fair to say that observation has also, covers a range, and at the crude end of observation would be the ones that are only there for a few days in totality of the whole mission, and you are looking at whether it's free and fair.
Yep.
But I would say that many observation methodologies have evolved way beyond that. They do not use the term free and fair at all.
Yep.
They look at whether an election is in line with international standards, and they will really go in depth on everything you can draw from ICCPR, Article 25, and all the general comment about it, and how a genuine and credible election must reflect the will of the voters. Sure. And therefore, if you have the three candidates with the same name, that's not going to work. That's not going to be in compliance. So it was really just a...
Yeah, well, I'll respond to it anyway. So I think that you're right in the sense that there is obviously a massive range, right, in election observation quality. And I will say that it's a good thing to point out, too, that one of the new tactics that autocrats use is it's a phenomenon called zombie monitors, where you effectively are using monitors that are from a friendly organization. The organization's only purpose is to rubber stamp an election, right? And a group of autocrats have created these, there's various names for them. But they go to various elections and they observe them and they always say it was good. And then in the media reports, if a journalist isn't aware of the fact that this one group is not legitimate compared to, say, the Carter Center or the EU, you end up getting a report that says mixed results, even if there's universal condemnation, right? So it's muddying the waters. It's a very effective tactic. I'm sorry if I downplayed the degree to which the learning has happened on the observer's side. It has, and it is much more sophisticated. My problem is that when you write these reports, and they are very technical and very detail-oriented, the only international consequences that tend to occur are the newspaper report or the government condemnation, and not the actual technical report. And I think there's a large degree of reports, when I was doing research for my PhD and beyond, where I would read these reports and you'd be like, okay, I think this is a negative report, but it's like point 1 is negative, point 2 is positive, point 3 is negative, point 4 is positive. It muddies the waters. There's no clear direction. And then at the end of the day, you're like, well, the negative point is that only fake candidates were allowed to contest the election, or sort of regime-friendly candidates were allowed to contest the election. After that conversation ends, I don't care if there was no ballot box stuffing. And so I think there needs to be a hierarchy of types of manipulation that are so egregious that the election observation ends. And I wish that happened more, because it is, observers think in technical terms, I think. And I think it is a very wise thing that they do so, because they're thinking, okay, we have to have an international standard that we can point to that's been violated. which is absolutely objective. But I also think that if observation is to achieve its goal, they have to think politically. Because observation is not just about, it's not a box-ticking exercise. It's not one that says, look, this part was bad, this part was good. It's about trying to impose costs on rigged elections. And right now, I think that even though the learning has been achieved, the costs are minimal. And so you have to question, if the government's going to endorse rigged elections and impose no external costs on the regime, what is the observation for? And the answer is either to create a record, or to help empower domestic opposition, which is another area that I think is something that needs to be done more effectively. The seamless working with, trying to domestic civil society, to have the tools by which opposition groups can actually say, look, this was rigged, and we know it was rigged, and we're going to use the reports in more effective ways to challenge the regime. Because as I see it now, there is too much technical focus in a way that's not thinking about the sort of savvy political operation that would actually make autocrats think twice about these things.
Reporting elections in Africa since the late 70s and observing mostly for the EU since 2010. And what you say about the reports is very important. And I've seen over the years the rigging has moved in time from the voting day, later and later and later. And now most of the worst rigging is in the collation and results process. And yet the EU and the Commonwealth and the other organisations insist on doing their preliminary report within usually 2 days before the official head of mission goes back to Europe or wherever, which is hopeless. In many elections recently, the process has still been going on. Even if they could give it a week before everybody lost interest totally, they would have a chance to see and incorporate more than the actual voting. They say this is to the end of polling, but nobody takes any notice.
So I think this is a really important aspect where you have movement away from election day in both ways. So you have more strategic rigging that's happening, say, 6 to 8 months before the election, and also more rigging that happens in collation and counting. That being said, the problem is, with the Madagascar election, which is a country that's, it's a country that's so peripheral to the West's interest that, I have a Google alert that says every time Madagascar is mentioned on an internet story, and it's usually about the cartoon or the ice musical or whatever it is, right? So, or if there's a storm and vanilla production is affected, right? So my point in saying that is that Madagascar's election is going to get one story probably in most serious international journalistic outlets. It's probably going to get the one Reuters story, maybe one from Al Jazeera, whatever it is. And the problem is they don't have an appetite for the second story that says, okay, here's the election today, and then a week later, here is the result, right? And so it's a problem with the media as well, right? It's where election observation teams need to say, we're going to have a new standard that says we're going to make a preliminary judgment, not the day of the election, not when 1% of ballots have been counted, but actually when the entire process is over. And if they set that standard universally, it would be fine. But the problem is, I witnessed this where it was like you're in one hotel. A lot of observers have had this experience. Well, all the observer teams are in one hotel because there's one main Western hotel in, say, an African capital. And you have especially in the least developed places, and you have all the observer teams are scheduling their press conferences, trying to scoop the other ones, right? They're trying to make sure that they're the ones that get in the press report. So if you have one group that's responsible and says, we're going to do we're going to wait until a week later, good luck getting the press when all the others have already issued their preliminary statements and they've been quoted. Right, so there's a problem about how we talk about elections that also needs to be fixed, where people are patient, they actually think about, okay, is this actually legitimate? They move quickly, it's not 6 months, but it's not also 6 minutes. And I think this is a very important point because you have the story of an election written on the day that the election happens. And until we have a more sophisticated way to condemn elections and also criticize them without sort of severing aid and all these other things, you're just going to have the stories that say, not free and fair or free and fair. And I know that your point is absolutely right about this, by the way, that so all the observation teams I've been in have never used those words. Every head of mission that gives the press conference has used those words. And so the problem is the lexicon around it, if you read journalistic reports, they use those words. So even if the learning has happened to say, look, we need to have more nuanced ways of talking about elections, The public doesn't think that way, so the journalist is waiting for that quote. And they're waiting for the person that says, was it free or fair or not free or fair, right? And at the end of the day, we have to get away from that.
Yeah, I've actually stimulated. My name's John, I run a UK-based observer.
Microphone.
I don't have a microphone, I'll try and shout. I think the thing I wrote, the most interesting about the talk is the sort of implicit nature of observation is that the West is best. And the countries we're looking at are countries which, we go to UK polling stations and we're told, why aren't you in Africa checking their elections rather than UK elections? And the thing I think most interesting about your talk is that the most important electoral event in Europe in the last 12 months has been in Catalonia. And now the EU, which said we don't need to send observers there, has said no, it's an internal Spanish matter. Or the LSE, which is responsible for Spain, doesn't deploy observers there, and Spain excluded all observers from the Catalonia elections, despite them being, part of the LSE. Is the problem that we have a sort of slightly myopic view of observation? Because you talk about America, I could talk about UK problems.
Sure.
But actually, there are problems with Western democracy that we're not talking about, which actually are one of the reasons that Eastern democracies think they can get away with these things, and we don't run a gold standard election, we run low standard elections.
So I think this is an excellent point on multiple fronts, and I think, so one is that I think that there should be observation in all elections, because I think there are always irregularities or problems that could be improved upon. And I think that one of the things that makes the message more effective from Western groups is to say, we're applying the same standards to us. Right? We're trying to make sure that we're going to invite observers to make sure that our elections are free and fair, so that when we tell you that yours are not, we've also gone through the same thing that you have. I think that's important. I do not think the West is best. I think that it is much more effective to have regional and local organizations that do self-policing. It's just responding to sort of a geopolitical reality that there are a lot of organizations that are local or regional that tend to be very kind to their own members simply because they know they're going to be up next, right? So you have, the African Union has made serious improvements, for example, but it's not made enough improvements. And you still have elections getting rubber stamped in ways that should not happen because the members of the countries that are sending the observers are figuring, well, what if our elections next year, what if we're the ones that are in the barrel, so to speak? So I don't want to sound like somebody who says the West needs to police the world. It's just the forces that have the authority to impose costs on authoritarian regimes tend to be Western governments. Because the Chinese certainly could, right? In Africa especially, like lost investment, but they have no appetite to do so. They have explicitly made that part of their foreign policy. And in terms of the model aspects, I think this is going to be one of the major costs of the Trump administration. I know I am personally very anti-Trump, but I think it's one of the major costs is that him modeling strongman behavior in attacking the press and nepotism and ethics violations and all these other things undercuts the message. I mean, how does the State Department lecture a country that's jailing journalists when they say it's fake news? They can't. I mean, they still try. But you have, again, a learning mechanism where Myanmar said that the reports about massacres of Rohingya were fake news. And they use that term, right? So this is something where the modeling of such behaviors in Western democracies and the flaws in Western democracies end up amplifying the ability not just for countries to perform in certain ways with a blind eye from the West, but also to emulate it and learn from it.
Two more questions.
Hi, my name is Viviana Sarmiento. I'm from Colombia and I work on an NGO that actually does electoral observation. And one of the main finance resources that our organization had comes from the US AED. And right now with Trump's budget, that the State Department and USAID, they will have problems financing this. And regarding your comment on how the West is turning away the problem of democratic observation and standards for other countries, my question is, what can we do for making electoral observation cheaper, and also because in the case of Colombia, sending observers is very difficult in certain regions because of the geography, mainly. And access to certain places, it's extremely difficult and costly. So how can we do to make it cheaper, and also how can we make authorities around the world to concern about democracy again? We know that there are many issues right now going on, but this is still important. So.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. I'll answer all of
Yeah, Michael Amoa from the LSE. Mine is actually on the back of Elizabeth Blunt's comment that these days it's actually the collation and the end game of the actual, just before the announcements, that's where the rigging can actually take place. I mean, there's no international regulation that allows international observers to go anywhere near the computation. It's state property. Yeah. And even within states, there's no legislation that actually allows any other party, local or international, to access the database. Yeah. So going forward, I mean, can you comment on how, I mean, the whole monitoring is on a manual premises. Who is going to take responsibility to deal with where the rigging is, the computing?
Okay, so I think these are great questions, Edna. In terms of, and I'll try to answer them in sort of a similar way. So I think this is it's a political will problem. And it's also, again, where I say that the backbone needs to be strengthened in election observation groups and also in Western groups, and I'll talk about how to make it cheaper in a moment. But the reason why governments don't do these things is because there's limited cost to not doing them, right? So in other words, if you said to a government, no election observer from a legitimate Western organization will come if you do not allow us access to the collation process, and you do not show you could require that the polling precincts take photos of the tower in every single precinct in the country. You could require that every single precinct has the counts, because not every country releases precinct level data, right? It makes it very easy to rig if you don't have precinct level data, because you can just say, well, we've amalgamated the regions, so here's the rough number. So to my mind, the sea change that needs to happen is you need to say, we do not observe elections that don't have precinct level data made publicly available immediately. We do not observe elections that have computerized tallies that are not available for audits to Western observer groups. We do not observe elections, and the list goes on. As soon as you have a culture change where there's no sort of one group bucking the trend, right? I mean, if the EU does it and the Carter Center doesn't, well, the countries will keep doing whatever they can get away with the EU, because they'll at least get some observers. But if no observers are willing to participate in a process that they believe could be easily exploited in the collation process, for example, they'll stop doing it, because they do need that legitimization. Governments crave international legitimacy, and they crave also being at the table in sort of international organizations. And some governments are willing to have non-endorsed elections be enough to revoke that privilege, right? So to me, that sort of carrot is one that should be used much more effectively. When they say, look, we want to work with you, we want to improve your election process, but we're not even going to consider coming to your country unless you have these basic functions. And I think that's, it's difficult to object to that from the point of view of the regime if you say, all we want to see is, we want to be there in the room when you're collating. If you're not rigging anything, why do you care about that? And I think that the precinct level data, by the way, allows detection in different ways, which is the precinct level data. There's been evidence that humans, when they make up numbers with certain digits at the end more frequently. So for example, if you're trying to make up a number, if I say pick a number 1 to 100, most people don't pick 50, most people don't pick 35, right? They'd often pick some odd number, like 27. So if you have enough data at the precinct level, you can see that there's a disproportionate lowering of numbers that end in 0 and 5, and the numbers are being fabricated, right? But that requires data. If you have 27 regions, you can't do that. So there's things like this which you can be innovative about, but it requires transparency. The final point I'll just say is about the technology one. I think this is where voters could be empowered if they had an app that said, take a photo of the vote counting, stick around to the precinct, because in a lot of places in rural sub-Saharan Africa, for example, it's like sort of the spectacle. You watch the vote count happen. Have one of the people take a photo of the blackboard that shows the count. It's impossible once you have aggregated all of those precinct level snapshots to just change the numbers at the collation level. Because you can and also empowering domestic groups like opposition parties to ensure that they're keeping records. Because this happened very successfully in Ghana recently, where there was actually a countrywide observation by the domestic groups. And it was hard to rig, because they actually said, look, here's our number. If the government number doesn't match, we know it was changed, right? That doesn't happen in every place, and it should. I'll just close with this to say that, I understand that I wanted to be very careful about sounding like the West is best. And I really appreciate that comment. No, I mean, I really do, because I'm very sensitive to it. But I think that there is a sea change in what's happening globally, where Western foreign policy is putting significantly less emphasis on democracy than it used to. Budgets are being cut. Observers are making reports that are not listened to. And fundamentally, this problem is not a technical problem, it is a political one. And if Western countries' citizens do not care about democracy promotion, their governments will not either. And that's why we need to make sure that we elect people who actually care about this and make it a priority for the rest of the world.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Brian, and thank you for participating. We can continue our discussion during the break. Thank you.
Thanks.